Alright boys, we're here with the T-72M2 Moderna. This is the top reward for the ongoing event in War Thunder at the minute. Now, it's quite a grind to unlock this tank, I'm not going to lie. I think it's like 6 or 7 of continuous grinding every day for the next like 10 days or something. It's pretty stupid how they do these events, I'm not a fan of it at all. But anyway, is this tank a good reward? Well, let's find out together. The T-72M2 is a rank 6 battle rating 10.0 event vehicle in the Soviet tech tree. This means the vehicle will come stock, and it is not a premium vehicle. You will not get a bonus RP or silver line multiplier playing this vehicle. That is also reflected in the crew training cost, which is 210,000 silver lions. And for the expert in ace qualifications, it's 740,000 silver lions and 2,100 golden eagles respectively. In terms of customization, you have loads of camouflage to be able to purchase for golden eagles. So, is this tank good? Well, the TLDR version is yes, it is good. But if Guardian thinks I'm going to play War Thunder for 6 hours a day to unlock this shit, then they can piss off. Seriously lads, playing any game, especially War Thunder, for 6 hours a day is ridiculous. I think I'd throw myself off a bloody bridge if I had to play it for 3 hours a day. Anyway, I probably shouldn't derail my own video. Let's take a look at the tank. Starting as always with the mobility and survivability, and the tank is powered by an engine producing 850 horsepower. Combined with a vehicle's weight of 44.5 tons, you have a pretty poor power to weight ratio of 19.1 horsepower per ton. For a battle rating 10.0 vehicle, this is pretty poor, especially compared to the T-80B, which is like a bloody rocket compared to this thing, as well as the Leopard 2A4s. I'm going to say something now that I'm probably going to repeat quite a lot in this video. This tank is basically a modernised T-72A. Now if you don't understand what I mean by that, basically, it's shite. Both the base mobility and the base armour profiles are pretty poor in this tank, but we'll get onto that shortly. Anyway, the mobility. It has a pretty decent top speed of 60 km per hour, which is pretty good for this battle rating. But again, like most Soviet vehicles, it's let down by its poor reverse speed, which is only 5 km per hour. And while I know the whole Soviet doctrine never considered going backwards, but as we've seen from Ukraine, maybe the Russians should have added a few more reverse gears. Don't know if to keep that in the video, might be a little bit too spicy. Anyway, the poor reverse speed is a major downside, just like it is on pretty much all Soviet vehicles. You can't retreat out of cover, and combined with the poor power to weight ratio, you just feel like a brick on the battlefield. Once again, an analogy I've made quite a lot recently, it kind of feels like a sluggish Challenger 2, which is saying something. Basically, it's just not enjoyable to drive around. You feel bloated, you can't really rotate your hull, the hull traverse is god awful. God forbid you get on a map with sand or snow, because then it's only just better than driving a bloody mouse. Anyway, the survivability, it isn't too much better to be honest. Basically, the T-72M2 is based on the Czechoslovakian T-72M1, which itself is the export version of the Soviet T-72A. The M2 modernization package added a few new things, but seeing as we're talking about the survivability, the most important addition was the explosive reactive armour, which was a Czechoslovakian copy of Relict. This is the Dynas ERA, of which we have 2 versions on this tank. We have a thin one and a thicker one. Very scientific terms indeed. Anyway, the thinner ERA is found on the side of the hull. It gives you 10mm of protection against kinetic energy rounds and 550mm of protection against chemical rounds. And then the thicker ERA blocks, which is present on the upper frontal plate, as well as the turret front, gives us 100mm of protection against kinetic energy rounds, and the same 550mm against chemical. All in all, the addition of this ERA is pretty good, and when combined with the rather average stock armour, does make the T-72M2 quite tanky. Just bear in mind however, once this ERA has been detonated, you are incredibly vulnerable. But if we take a quick look at the armour itself, and against this tank's own gun at a range of 500 meters, you can basically lol pen your lower frontal plate. It is worth bearing in mind however, it does provide over 400mm of protection, so this should protect you from a lot of the early APF SDS rounds. But at battle rating 10.0, which in all reality is going to be an up tier to 11.0, most enemies will be able to lol pen you, at least on the lower frontal plate. Moving up to the turret is where this tank does start to shine. You can see on either side of the cheeks, we have nearly 700mm of protection. Again, this is with the ERA, so once it has been shot off, Our turret protection will be significantly weaker, but all in all, the turret armour of the T-72M2 is very impressive. But in reality, this tank is basically just the T-72AV terms, with a little bit better ERE protection. So stay hull down if possible, minimising the exposure of that terrible upper frontal plate. And unlike other Soviet vehicles, playing hull down is kind of a viable strategy in the Moderna, as it has 6 degrees of gun depression, compared to the average Soviet tank, which has around 4 to 5 degrees of gun depression. It's not much, but every millimetre counts. The gun also has a standard 13 degrees of gun elevation, but that isn't really too important. Anyway, the main gun is of course a 125mm, and for this tank, it is the 2A46M1 cannon. This tank is obviously a T-72, so it has the same T-72 autoloader, which can reload a shell every 7.1 seconds. The tank itself can carry 44 rounds of ammunition in total, however the autoloader only carries 22 rounds. Taking any more than 22 rounds into battle will result in ammunition being stored in the turret. And again, as we've seen from Ukraine, you really don't want ammunition in your turret. And while you are unlikely to encounter an N-Law or a Javelin in War Thunder, a 20 kilo APFSDS round travelling at 1500 meters per second probably isn't much better. So again, take 22 or less rounds of ammunition into battle. We now come on to probably the biggest downside of this tank in my opinion. That is the absolute god-awful targeting speed, also known as the turret rotation speed. This tank's turret rotation is like one of the late Panzer IVs. It's like the gunner's probably hand cranking it in there. It turns incredibly slowly, which in top tier is pretty much a death sentence. Because the tanks at battle rating 10.0 are so fast, you really do need to be snappy, and this poor turret rotation speed, in combination with the really sluggish hull traverse rate, gives this tank incredibly bad gun handling in my opinion. Anyway, one thing I have yet to mention is a 30mm autocannon. I'm going to say straight away, I don't want you to get angry with me, now this is largely a gimmick. In my opinion, it's only really useful if you mess up your first shot with your main gun. Say if you shoot an enemy but it bounces, you can then spam your 30mm to either distract them or knock out the turret or track or gun barrel. It's kind of like a little bit of a safety net. It's not really something that's useful if you're actually a competent player and you manage to kill a tank in a first shot. I know most of the time you aren't going to one-shot kill someone. It's just this, the 30mm gun, it's a good backup, but it's not something that you should be wanting to do. It's basically just like the 20mm that's found on the Leopard 2K. It's basically just used for shooting down low-flying helicopters and generally pissing people off. It's worth noting, however, that even though this is the same 30mm gun found on the BMP2, you do not have the 30mm APDS belt. You only got the stock belt on the BMP2, which consists of armor-piercing tracer and high-explosive fragmentary incendiary rounds. While at point blank range, this still does give you a very impressive 65mm of penetration. You don't get that 80mm pen with the APDS belt. The ammunition is also quite low muzzle velocity compared to the APDS belt. So don't be thinking that this is a BMP2 firepower as well as a 125mm gun firepower. But speaking of the 125 firepower, let's cover the ammunition. Our stock round, and yes remember, this vehicle will come stock when you unlock it. So guess what boys? You've grinded for 6 hours a day, and then you've got a nice stock heater fest grind. Don't you guys just love gauging? Anyway, this is the 3BK12M. It's a heater fest round obviously. It travels actually very slowly, but it does penetrate 440mm of armour. Not terrible. We then have the 3OF26, this is a high explosive round. It has a warhead containing 5.24 kilos of TNT, giving it 42mm of explosive penetration. Like all Soviet high explosive rounds, it's pretty good for memeing on people, but it's not really that reliable. We then have a short rod penetrator, the 3BM2. This travels very fast actually, at 1760 meters per second, and at a range of 500 meters, it can penetrate 415mm of flat armor. To be honest boys, this isn't a terrible APFSDS round, but things really get going once you unlock your top round, the TAPNA or TAPNA. Compared to the other APFSDS round, this is a long rod penetrator. This travels slightly slower at 1690 meters per second, but at 500 meters it can penetrate 500mm of armor, which for battle rating 10.0 is actually pretty good. So what is my overall thoughts about this tank? Well, I've already said it once in this video. The T-72M2 is basically a T-72 AV terms with slightly better protection. It plays like a terms, drives like a terms, shoots like a terms, and is probably going to be as cancerous as a terms. Lots of newer players are going to get this tank, probably play terribly in it and substantially bring down the Soviet win rate. I'm pretty sure this is Gaijin's master plan, to tank the Soviet win rate down so much that they can introduce the T-14 Armata, as well as giving all the Soviet top tier vehicle the Svinets-2 round. And considering they added the Puma at battle rating 8.3, they'd almost certainly say that was balanced. Anyway, all joking aside, the T-72M2 is a pretty decent tank at the minute. The major letdowns are of course that turret rotation speed. This is an absolutely massive limitation of the tank. I can't emphasize enough just how poor it is, especially if you're used to playing more NATO tanks like the Abrams or the Leopards, which have really snappy turrets. If the M1 Abrams is a fit, healthy sportsman, then the T-72M2 is a 90-year-old man with severe arthritis. The mobility is also a massive weak spot, not as bad as the gun rotation, but the survivability is surprisingly good. As I'm sure you've seen from the video, I got hit by quite a lot of enemy stuff and somehow managed to survive. That could have been pot luck, but I think the ERA is pretty good on the tank. You've also seen that the gun is pretty powerful. You've got a very powerful APF SDS round, as well as 3rd generation thermal imaging for the gunner and commander. So no complaints there really. Should you grind this? Absolutely not. No one should play War Thunder for 6 to 7 hours a day. When this thing goes on the marketplace, it's probably going to be fairly expensive, I'm guessing. Which at that point, you may as well just buy the T-72AV turbs. It's probably cheaper and better. You won't get up tiered as much, you'll get down tiered at 9.7. So, should you grind this tank? If you like collecting and you like kill tanks, yeah. If you want a tank that's going to effectively and efficiently grind the Soviet Tetri, the T-72AV is probably going to be better, slightly lower battle rating, more meta, it's probably going to be cheaper when it goes on the marketplace, and it does pretty much everything the same, apart from it lacks a 30mm gun. Anyway, if you liked the video, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing. If you really like the video, then please do consider becoming a channel member, like Deboa LX, Just Someone, Destroyer 1805, Dr. Bob, Tans, William Tessier, and Lola Alfonsi. Thanks again for watching, lads, and I'll see you in the next review.